Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and not necessarily great to be talking about Australian politics, but that's what I do, so I've got no choice, as depressing as it might be. Talking about the state of politics is one thing, but I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the election, where I see the issues that are going to unfold, how I think the result is likely to unfold and why, and then talk a little bit about not just the upper house and some of the permutations that are important in that respect, but also what I see as some of the debates in the aftermath, assuming that my prediction that Bill Shorten wins is accurate. I probably should start with a caveat that everything I say you should probably take with a grain of salt, as much as that's a bit of a credibility sapping start. I predicted that Kevin Rudd would never become Prime Minister because I'd met him before he became Prime Minister. Sorry to pass that on. But I was wrong about that. I then predicted there's no way that he would fail to survive a first term. I thought Julia Gillard would win a majority. I didn't think that Kevin Rudd would ever come back. I thought there was no chance that Tony Abbott would become Prime Minister. And once he did, I thought there was even less chance that the Liberal Party would emulate Labor and knock him off in his first term. I thought that Malcolm Turnbull would rush to an election and therefore have a sizable majority. And I didn't see a pathway in any way, shape or form for Peter Dutton to try to challenge, much less for Scott Morrison to then come through the middle. Yeah, so it's with that track record that I firmly predict that Bill Shorten will win the next election. But the reason that I'm more confident this time than I was on each of those occasions, with the possible exception of Abbott getting rolled in his first term, I really didn't see that happening, whatever his limits were. But the reason I'm so confident that Bill Shorten will win the next election is just the raw arithmetic of where the polls are at, as well as where the complexion of the seats are at for the coalition. I mean, they literally go into this election with 74 seats, needing to win seats to become a majority government. And I just think that's very much a bridge too far for them, particularly with the nature of the messaging that they're going to be required to deliver at this election, which is quite different from electorate to electorate, much less from state to state. So these, I think, are the real problems that Morrison faces. I mean, obviously, you look at someone like Howard, who increased his majority in 01 and then again in 04, and that makes you think, well, it's possible. But a lot has changed on the campaigning front as well between then and now, and the strength of seat-by-seat campaigning, as well as knowing what's going on electorate by electorate between the major parties, I believe, is now with the Labor Party. Whereas during the Howard years, it was very much with the sort of Mark Textor-led research of the Howard government and the Liberal Party at that time. So when you bring all of that together, I just find it very hard to see how someone like Scott Morrison, in the wake of the tumult of what's happened to the coalition as well as within the Liberal Party in the last few months, but over the last few years as well, I don't see how they manufacture a victory. And that's very much what they're trying to do, obviously, is manufacture that victory. On the policy front, on the one hand, when you look at what's happening around Labor's genuinely bold plans, Sir Humphrey might say courageous, around tax, which when you look at it in some detail, there's a lot of logic for, at least in my opinion. However, it's a hard sell at a sort of generic, superficial political level. So the coalition are going after them on that front, and then obviously they're going after them on the boats front as well. But I don't think that their campaigns will have the bite that they might have once had in the past. So, for example, John Howard had similar attacks against Labor over a sustained period of time, but he had, rightly or wrongly, an economic credibility that I don't think that this government has. And he also had, if you like, a first shot in the locker on the boats, which I think now the public are more in tune with and more sceptical about that. And I also think that the links being drawn are a lot more tenuous for the campaign that they're trying to mount now on the boats versus, for example, what Howard tried to use to his advantage much earlier at the turn of the century. So when you look state by state, I think that based on where things are at, Victoria is really the problem for the coalition. I don't say that pejoratively, I'm not on their side, but for them, that is the problem state. To the extent that they think that they can try to hold the line up here in Queensland, you're all probably much better placed than I am to tell me how true or otherwise that is. But even if it's true, and even if the coalition in its best case scenario can hold its complexion of seats up here in Queensland and possibly even pick up Herbert as their one hope that they have. Even if they were to do that, you look to Victoria and they've got huge problems in Corangamite. Obviously Chisholm with Julia Banks going is going to be a nigh impossible hold for them. So Corangamite, Chisholm, Latrobe, Deakin with Suka is a problem for them, and that's before you get to seats like Aston and Flinders where Labor thinks it's also a chance to pick up seats as well. So Victoria is a problem, and there's a case study that we all have from the state election which potentially suggests that the kind of fear campaign that they're now trying to run at the federal level on boats is unlikely to work in a state like Victoria based on the fear campaign that the state opposition Liberals tried to run on a different matter. So Victoria is a problem state for them. Tasmania, they had hopes or have had hopes of picking Bass up, but really this goes to the problems that the coalition faces with mixed messaging, because on the one hand, in somewhere like Tasmania, they're trying to now look like they're the friend of renewables at the same time as mount the kind of campaign on boats, for example, which doesn't work as effectively at all in somewhere like Tasmania as it might in other parts of the country. So that's a problem for them as well. And you know, we see the news today. I assume you've all seen it, but there's the speculation now that Christopher Pyne and Stephen Chobo are about to have their names added to the list of retirees. Who's already announced? Chobo has now announced. Okay, he must. I knew Chobo had done a pre-recorded interview with Laura Jays for Sky News announcing. I didn't realise he'd decided to get out ahead of that pre-record. Christopher Pyne had planned to announce on the 13th of March, which was the anniversary of his election. You know, really historic moment. But so my understanding is that is also confirmed in the sense that he will presumably come out publicly as well. Craig Laundy is absolutely going. That's the worst kept secret in Canberra, and his seat of Reid in New South Wales is not one that I believe that the Liberals are capable of holding without him. He picked it up off Labor and actually managed to increase the majority in that electorate at the last election, despite most other seats around the country going backwards for the Liberals. So, there's a sort of stench of political death, if you like, about the government as people are departing. And when you look around the states, even their best case scenario makes it very hard to see how they can manufacture a victory, because in their eyes, the way that they would do it would be to pick up this is what Liberal strategists say, pick up Herbert, possibly pick up Bass, win back Wentworth, manage to hold Warringah, although that's one where there's mixed views about whether that's a necessary requirement, and then manage to hold the line in most other places and therefore eke out a majority. It's nigh impossible to see how they do that. The more interesting question for me is if their campaign bites against the Labor Party on boats and probably to a more significant extent on taxes, do they deny Bill Shorten not so much a majority, I think he would get there, but do they deny him a powerful majority in government? I think that causes some ongoing frictions in the nature of where Australian politics is at if they manage to do that. People forget that Kevin Rudd only won with a 7-seat majority, was it? A 7 or 8-seat majority in 2007. Unlike Bob Hawke, who I think had a 13 or 14-seat majority in a smaller parliament back in 1983. And the size of victory, I think, is going to be, for me, the important thing to look at when we look post-election, because Bill Shorten will be forced to govern quite differently, I believe, if he only picks up a relatively small majority rather than what had looked certain or near certain, which is now perhaps a bit more contested, which is the size of that victory, as opposed to whether he actually manages to achieve a victory at all. In terms of marginal seat campaigning, third-party endorsements and organisations like GetUp, and there really isn't a Conservative equivalent, even though they like to claim that there is, I think they'll also have a profound effect at the election. I mean, up here in Queensland, I think Peter Dutton has got significant problems in his electorate, which he would have had anyway, but they're exacerbated by the assistance that an organisation like GetUp is able to provide to the Labor candidate. That is the same as a challenge for Tony Abbott in his electorate of Warringah, and those sort of third forces, if you like, are also very mobilised against particular Liberal Party candidates. I mean, one of the interesting phenomenons, I think, in modern politics is in the rise of the 24-hour news cycle. The and these third candidates are almost a response to this. You know, the enemy from behind you is more significant in some respects to the damage that they can do than the partisan enemy opposite you. Liberals in particular find, you know, the tendency of so many of their backbench to appear on Sky News and to, you know, sort of force their party to the right on particular issues, if I can use that way of expressing it. They find that a more debilitating confrontation often than having to face up to their political opponents in the fight that they might have, because the internals of that create such problems for them. At this election though, those realities I think are going to rebound a little bit on some of those candidates. That's why it's interesting to see someone like Tony Abbott start to hush up a little bit now in the national campaign because of the realities of the pressures that he's facing in Warringah. So these sort of individual contests are making life even harder for this government, because on the one hand they've got the political contest against the Labor Party, where they see the primary aim being key marginal seats. Yes, there are state by state differences, but they're looking to campaign into those marginals to be able to defeat their political opponent. But they're also facing, you know, third party challenges from independents in seats like, obviously, Kerryn Phelps as the city member in Wentworth, where they're hoping to reclaim that. In a seat like Warringah as well, Indi is its own version of the same thing. And these challenges for them are, if you like, mixing their messages in terms of how they're looking to fight the campaign. And in a campaign organisational sense, Labor has become far more adroit than the Liberal Party at managing marginal seat individual contests and directing resources into those particular contests. During the Howard era, it was more of a macro style of campaign, where you'd have broader research with a macro campaign as your primary focus, and then just have, you know, sort of party political troops on the ground in individual seats. Now it's become so much more professionalised, and Labor have really picked that up much more than the Liberal Party, is my read of it, both in the techniques that they deploy, but also just in terms of the human capital that they're able to deploy into key seats as well. So the coalition has all sorts of shortfalls going into this campaign that it might not have otherwise had because of the circumstances that it's put itself, but they're exacerbated by some of the strengths that the Labor Party have built up over the years. So start with fundraising. On a fundraising front, you know, the removal of Malcolm Turnbull means that their single biggest donor from the 2016 election is unlikely to donate at this election. I'd be very surprised if Malcolm Turnbull felt the need to put his hand in his pocket. You've then got the retirements of Julie Bishop and soon to be announced Craig Laundy. Well, Julie Bishop was their best fundraiser at the big end of town, and she's not going to be nearly as active on that front, particularly now that we know she's unlikely to even get her own candidate up in her seat of Curtin that she wanted. Matthias Cormann, as the factional power broker out of WA, has come in over the top on that front, it would seem, as well. So she's unlikely and won't be fundraising the way that she once did. And then Craig Laundy, he was the best fundraiser in the sort of smaller end of town in a business sense, you know, medium and small businesses. And he, as a retiree who was a Turnbull supporter, he equally isn't going to be putting his hand in his pocket nor doing the fundraising that he once did either. So on all of these levels, in terms of fundraising, the Liberal Party is struggling. I haven't even talked yet about the National Party, because you've then got the tensions between the Liberal and the National Party. I know that they're an amalgam up here, but those tensions are a real problem as well for the government to try to hold its line. There's Barnaby Joyce pushing for a separate Senate ticket in New South Wales. You've got the recent announcement that a former state minister out of New South Wales is now going to contest the seat of Gilmore, which Warren Mundine has been parachuted into as the Liberal candidate, having removed the pre-selected Liberal candidate, who himself was already on the nose because the retiring Liberal member claimed that there was bullying involved in the process. So that's Gilmore, which is meant to be one of the key marginal seats that they need to hold, and it's hard to see how they do that when you've now got it turned into, you know, such a quagmire for them with the National Party contesting against a Liberal who's an outsider post a messy pre-selection stoush with a retiring member. So the tensions between the Nationals and the Liberals are very real, and they're making campaign cooperation more difficult. I'm not as aware of the details of how this is working within the LNP up here in Queensland, other than to say that I've been told, so I've only got this secondhand, but I've been told that that there are significant tensions within the old Liberal and National realms within the LNP up here in Queensland, and then where resources are getting deployed on the campaign front. But that's as much that I can speak to there. I'd also keep a close eye on Western Australia at this election, not because it'll be relevant to the result. I suspect by the time results start to filter in 3 hours late from WA, the election will be over. So maybe only I'll be watching. But Western Australia often swings wildly and outside the usual cycle. It's been a long time since WA has swung Labor from the Liberal Party. I mean, even now, after the 2016 election, Labor only holds 5 of the 16 seats in the West. And even when Kevin Rudd won in 2007, I think it only held 3 of the then 15 seats in the West. It's due for a correction. And in the wake of the Barnett government losing, I think that there are a number of seats in WA that I know that the Labor Party have on their key seats target. The Labor Party is targeting 35 seats nationally on its key seats target. Now, they obviously won't get them all, but that speaks to the fact that they really do have a confidence in their capacity to pick up seats at this election rather than just go for a smaller set of seats to be able to secure a majority. They are targeting 35 seats from the government, which, given that they've only got 74, is a really interesting fact, I think. But in WA, you've got the obvious seats such as Hasluck that they're going for, and Swan as the 2 most marginal seats. But Stirling is very much now in play with Michael Keenan's announced retirement. It's a 6.1% margin, but that's an inflated margin because of him being a long-term member who's always been a very well cashed up member as well, which the new candidate won't nearly be able to emulate. So Stirling's now in play as a 3rd seat. Canning, I believe, is in play, and it is on the target list for the Labor Party. That's Andrew Hastie's seat. The argument being that because he's part of that reactionary right within the Liberal Party, and even though that might play out relatively well in an electorate like Canning demographically, there are still cohorts of it that might react badly to that. The Attorney General, Christian Porter, has got real problems in the electorate of Pearce. He believes that he will hold it because, he doesn't say this is now me adding to that, but partly because at the last election, he took for granted when switching from state politics to federal politics the size of his margin going into that election, and it massively collapsed at the election. So he feels that there's if you like, a bit of built-in electoral fat that he can get back, taking the seat a little bit more seriously. But it is on just, I think, a 3.5% margin now, and Labor are targeting it because they see Christian Porter as a potential future Liberal leader. So they're doing it not just as a key seat that they believe they can win, but they're doing it as a longer-term play in terms of trying to weaken the other side of politics by targeting that seat. I wrote today in The Australian about Tony Abbott's seat of Warringah. I still think that he's probably the marginal favourite to hold that seat, but it's an interesting one. My point of the piece today was to say that if Bill Shorten is helping, indirectly, the Labor Party are helping the campaign to unseat Tony Abbott, I actually think, politically speaking, they're better off not to. If Tony Abbott is around in the aftermath of the next election, I think that's a bonus for the Labor Party, personally, because I think it's more likely to stoke the kind of divisions in the Liberal Party on policy as well as on personality that would benefit Labor in the aftermath of an election victory rather than harm them. But his seat is interesting. I saw some numbers in The Australian today which I don't personally agree with in relation to where his primary vote needs to be to win or lose. He won 51% primary at the last election, and there was a few independents that were running against him, but they were relatively low grade. If his primary vote drops far below 45%, it's hard to see where he picks up preferences to be able to get himself over the line. And that's only a 6-point turnaround with a high-profile independent added into the mix, with how monetised her campaign is, with the added level of resentment against Tony Abbott over the course of the last 3 years with the role that he's played, whether you agree or disagree with it. He was a bit more of a figure of some sympathy in some quarters in 2016. not now. So I think that there's a lot to be said for the fact that he's got real problems in that seat. But, you know, he's obviously campaigning hard locally, so we will see. In terms of the upper house, I think that this election is going to be really interesting, both just for how it ends up being shaped, but also for what that means in the aftermath for a new government. If I'm right, like I have been so many times in the past with my prediction, and Bill Shorten does win the election. This is the first half Senate election with the new Senate reforms in place. They were in place before the last election, but obviously it was a double dissolution. They were designed, at least, to be able to make it more difficult for micro parties in particular, but minor parties more generally, to be as successful. So the hope of the major parties is that in time they can perform better with these electoral reforms than they otherwise might have before changing the way that votes are cast. Because the last election was a double dissolution and this is a half Senate election, the half Senate that is up will be disproportionately full of minor party candidates because of the way that they divvy up the two halves, which means that you would assume that there's going to be potentially a number of minor parties that actually fall out of electoral representation at this election. So the two things that are going to be buttressing up against one another are an electoral system which is, at least by design, supposed to make it easier for major parties, with the possible exception of the Greens, who supported the legislation, to do well, up against the reality that there is a level of voter disillusionment towards major parties at the moment, which is seeing people's tendency be to vote more frequently for minor parties and independents. And so how that sort of, if you like, constitutes the Senate in the aftermath of the election is perhaps something that we can talk about, because I think it's going to be really interesting and really pivotal to the type of government that the Shorten government becomes. The aftermath of the election and sort of where to from here, I mentioned already the size of the victory being an important element in the kind of Prime Minister Bill Shorten becomes. I think that he's going to surprise people on the upside as a Prime Minister, actually. I know that the polls show that he's unpopular and that he's in the sort of Tony Abbott realm of unpopularity, but polling also shows us historically that new Prime Ministers do get a fair go and they get a fresh start from the electorate. Even Tony Abbott started with a positive net satisfaction rating as Prime Minister. He just managed to lose it within a matter of 2 months. I think that Bill Shorten's going to be really cognizant of wanting to not just become Prime Minister after the track record that we've had of no Prime Minister serving a full term since Howard in his last term. I think that Bill Shorten's going to really want to do more than just tick the box of becoming PM. I think he's going to want to try to manufacture a contrast to the recent Prime Ministers that we've had, you know, the four of them, and maybe not emulate Howard. I don't know if the modern era will allow that as easily as the past has, but he will want to survive longer and thrive in the role rather than simply tick the box. I think global economic conditions might be a reality that mug him in that respect. The Senate might be a real problem for him in terms of being able to get his agenda implemented without significant amendments, but nonetheless, he has other factors in his favour, like the changed leadership structure, which I know can be relatively easily changed as well, but I think culturally it has had an impact already on Labor, such that in government I'm not sure that they will necessarily revert to the type that we've seen from both sides of politics in government in recent years. So he's got that to his advantage. I think he's also got to his advantage the fact that this government, and this isn't quite a perfect comparison, but they come to government with significant governing experience from the Rudd and Gillard years, and that is unusual for newly minted governments to be, but because of the quick turnaround, we're talking about people that aren't just there with experience, but if you like, the second 11 from the previous era, which is sort of the problem I think that the Abbott government faced. A lot of the people that John Howard had concerns about as being senior players in a long-term electorally successful administration then had their shot but they weren't really at the vanguard of what made that government more successful. This is different because this time you've got those same players that were the senior players other than the two Prime Ministers effectively, I guess Wayne Swan as well I should note, but you've got a significant number of those senior players back with the experience from when they were last in government. Not just the experience of what went right and wrong in a policy sense, but also in terms of the things that created instability and what needs to be avoided the second time around. I think that, coupled with Bill Shorten being the Prime Minister, he was the one very common thread between the downfalls of both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. He's not going to bring himself down. So he doesn't have to worry about a Bill Shorten in his ranks, if you like. So I think that's another upside that he has. And the truth of it is, from my read of it, is that Chris Bowen and Anthony Albanese are perceived as his main rivals. Tanya Plibersek probably should be, but for some reason isn't perceived as a primary rival, and they almost cancel each other out. There's Shorten is very adroit at the politics and the manoeuvring, and I think that, coupled with his ambition to try to be more successful and become sort of a mini-me version of Bob Hawke, I just think he might surprise people on the upside, particularly when you factor in that Australians do tend to give new Prime Ministers a fair go when they start. It wouldn't surprise me. I think that potentially the biggest challenge for a new Labor government is that if the Liberal Party and if the coalition goes into the dark, deep days of opposition and start tearing themselves apart, as I believe they will, then you lose that important check of a robust opposition. But more in recent history, the check of a robust opposition has been more akin to an opposition that plays populist politics and therefore actually, distorts the system and causes problems for a government rather than holds a government to account and makes it a better government, if you like. So maybe I'm wrong about that an opposition that starts tearing itself apart might actually be a benefit for a new Labor government because they just become a sidebar while the new government gets on with governing. But that's certainly my prediction for the Liberal Party, unless they lose narrowly. If the Liberal National Coalition only loses narrowly and believes that they're still in the fight, politically speaking, then there is less of a chance that they start ripping themselves apart. But if they lose, with a relatively sizable majority, then they've got some real issues to try to work out as an opposition. The nature of the coalition is problematic, I think, between the Nationals and the Liberals, but the Liberal Party itself doesn't really know what it does or doesn't stand for anymore. The concept of conservatism, in my view, has been overtaken by what I call this reactionary idea. That is to say that, Conservatives are supposed to defend institutions and only support change if it's very incremental and tested, pressure tested, whereas those who pass themselves off as conservatives in name now aren't very conservative by nature. They have elements of social conservatism, but that's really only one part of the equation. So for me, those debates are going to become quite totemic within the Liberal Party in particular once it falls into opposition. We're also going to see much more vocalising, I believe, by moderates in response so-called moderates, within the Liberal Party in response to some of these reactionaries, which has been a little bit muted up until now, and all of that will come out into the open much more in opposition. Having said that, there will be a generational clearing out that will occur within the Liberal Party. We're seeing it obviously as the sort of proverbial rats desert the sinking ship already. But that's a generational clearing out that didn't happen after the Howard years nearly as much as people expected that it might, and a lot of these guys held on. Some of it is happening by choice with resignation, some of it might happen by design with the likes of Abbott if they do lose a seat like Warringah. But that generational clearing out is going to be really interesting because if you'd gone back a couple of years ago, I think you would have said that would allow a fresh start without the personality bitternesses that have caused problems in the past. But the resurfacing of the leadership problems late last year actually, I think, caused some of those personality differences that aren't necessarily policy driven, but sometimes are, to go to the next generation as well. So, figures like an Angus Taylor, for example, or an Andrew Hastie, if he holds his seat, these type of figures are going to, if you like, live on with the fights that the Duttons, if they're gone, and the Abbotts, if they're gone, have fought on up until now, and then you've got moderate equivalents certainly that will take the other side of the debate, which were represented by the Brandises and the Pines and the Turnbulls to some extent. So I predict some dark days for the sort of right of politics in opposition. But I personally, I'd be interested to know what everyone thinks, but I think that the two-party system is so robust in this country institutionally that even where it gets challenged with independence or with the rise of independents and minor parties in the upper house in particular, where the electoral system is more supportive, I don't think that it challenges the two-party system. The fracturing of votes away from the Liberal Party on the right is interesting to me, with forces like One Nation and Cory Bernardi's Conservatives and so on, but I don't see it as challenging, the Liberal Party as the institution of the right any more than I think that, the rise and rise of the Greens has challenged the institutional party of the so-called left, the Labor Party. If anything, all it does is it takes some of the more extreme elements out of the party and then allows the party to perhaps find a way to reconfigure at the right moment in time. So if I had to pick, I would say that on election night, before we open up for Q&A, I think on election night where I think the election is going to be over quite quickly. Queensland, the votes will only come in an hour later than in New South Wales and Victoria, but I think that those results in Victoria will be so profound and seen quite quickly on the night, coupled with a few seats in New South Wales like Gilmore and Reid and possibly Banks, which are also going to shift quite quickly, which mean that we'll know, and also looking at Tasmania, we'll know that they don't pick up a seat like Bass or Braddon, in the early counting. And I think that will then tell us, well, the election is now lost for the government. We're now just simply looking at, to what extent. Let's see the results when they come in half an hour later in South Australia in seats like Boothby and Sturt with Pines retirement. Let's see what happens in Queensland, where there really are a plethora of seats that Labor can pick up if Queensland does move. And then sure, that size of that majority will only increase further when the results come in WA. But I don't think it'll be a long night, which means that it won't be a long night for us to know what's going on, but for the commentators that have to sit on the panels and endlessly gasbag for hours, it will be a very long night because the results will be well known fairly quickly, in my view. Thank you.